There is a very specific situation appearing for Gemini during this period. And unlike many readings that begin with emotions, relationships, or personal transformation, this one starts somewhere much more practical. Movement, transportation, routine, the systems that keep your everyday life functioning. Because the energy repeatedly shows a concern connected to mobility, a vehicle, a motorcycle, a ride-sharing service, public transportation, something you rely on regularly. And what stands out isn't a major problem, it's anticipation. You keep thinking about what could go wrong before anything actually happens. You get into your car and immediately wonder, what if something happens today? What if this breaks down? What if I end up spending money I wasn't planning to spend? What if this delays everything? And the interesting thing is that the reading doesn't show disaster. It shows mental exhaustion because the real issue isn't the vehicle. The real issue is how tired you've become of dealing with problems. When someone spends enough time solving one issue after another, even small inconveniences start feeling larger than they really are. A strange noise, a maintenance warning, an unexpected expense, a delay, a repair, a minor inconvenience. All of it begins carrying more emotional weight than it should. Not because it is serious, because you're tired. The reading keeps returning to one word: prevention. This is not a prediction of loss, it is a prediction of maintenance. The energy suggests that the more attention you give to small issues now, the less likely they are to become larger problems later. And this applies to much more than transportation. It applies to your routines, your responsibilities, your commitments, your finances, your health, anything that supports the structure of your daily life. Because Gemini enters a phase where small misalignments create cumulative stress. Things that seem insignificant individually begin adding up. And eventually the weight becomes noticeable. The reading suggests that organization becomes one of your greatest allies, not because everything is falling apart, because everything functions better when it receives attention before problems appear. There is another powerful theme emerging: the past. Not nostalgia, not memory. Reappearance. Someone from your past begins moving back into your awareness. And what makes this interesting is that they don't appear through direct contact first. The energy shows information arriving before the person does. You hear something, you see something, someone mentions them, you discover an unexpected detail, you come across news connected to them, and suddenly a chapter you thought was finished begins occupying your thoughts again. The feeling here is not closure, it is unfinished movement, as if a part of that story never fully settled. The reading shows questions beginning to form. Would things be different now? Was there more left unsaid than I realized? Did that connection end the way it was supposed to? And unlike dramatic readings that predict chaos or heartbreak, this energy feels much more subtle, more reflective, more uncertain. The person does not appear with destructive energy, but they do not appear fully resolved either. There is still emotional movement surrounding the connection. Something remains unfinished. Something remains unspoken. And because of that, the situation begins creating curiosity. There is another message that requires attention, especially for Gemini individuals who have children, younger siblings, or younger people they care deeply about. The reading shows concern connected to influence. A younger person begins growing close to someone who immediately creates discomfort within you, not because you have proof, not because anything dramatic has happened, because your instincts become activated. You look at the situation and think, something about this doesn't feel right. It could be a friendship, a romantic relationship, a new social connection, someone who enters their life carrying attractive words and appealing promises. And yet something about the energy feels off. The interesting thing is that the reading doesn't show immediate danger. It shows intuition. You begin noticing changes in behavior, changes in priorities, changes in attitude, changes in emotional distance. And before anyone else notices, you begin sensing that this influence may eventually create problems. The reading shows you observing first, watching, paying attention, trying to understand before interfering. And honestly, your instincts appear stronger than you realize. Because while the situation does not immediately become serious, the energy clearly suggests that the person entering this younger individual's life may be bringing confusion disguised as support. And Gemini notices it long before everyone else. The most important message of this opening phase is simple. Trust what you are observing, trust what you are feeling, and trust the subtle signals that keep repeating themselves. Because your awareness is becoming one of your greatest strengths during this period, and the more you listen to it, the more prepared you become for everything that follows. Now, the reading begins moving into an area that combines money, movement, and mental pressure. And honestly, this may be one of the strongest themes of the entire period. Because there is a situation involving travel, a major expense, or an opportunity that requires financial planning. For some Geminis, this appears as an actual trip. For others, it appears as a project. A purchase. A relocation. A course, a professional opportunity, something that initially feels exciting, something you genuinely want, something you can already imagine yourself doing. But then reality begins adding numbers to the dream, and that's when everything changes. The reading repeatedly shows you calculating, recalculating, comparing prices, checking details, looking at the total cost instead of the initial cost. Because at first, something seems manageable. Then additional expenses begin appearing. Transportation, food, fees, unexpected costs, extra commitments, things that weren't part of the original plan, and suddenly you realize, this is going to cost more than I thought. The important thing is that the reading does not show cancellation. It shows awareness. You begin understanding that enthusiasm alone is not a strategy. Planning is, and that realization protects you from future stress. Because Gemini enters a phase where emotional excitement could easily accelerate financial decisions. You see something, you want it, you tell yourself, I'll figure it out later. But later eventually arrives. And when it does, the accumulated cost feels much heavier. That is why the energy insists on one word: strategy. Research before deciding, compare before committing, plan before spending, think before reacting. Not because opportunities are bad, because opportunities become better when they are approached wisely. There is another strong theme appearing inside your home. And here the energy changes completely. The reading highlights something connected to your living space, electricity, appliances, maintenance, functionality. Something that has been asking for attention for longer than it should have. A strange sound, an unusual signal, a repair you've been postponing, a minor issue you've been telling yourself you'll handle later. The good news is that the reading does not show disaster. It shows awareness arriving at the right time. You notice the issue, you investigate it, you address it. And because of that, a larger problem is avoided. The deeper message here goes beyond the house itself, because your home is acting like a reflection of your internal world. Small things left unfinished. Small tasks waiting for attention, small problems accumulating quietly. The energy suggests that Gemini is entering a period of reorganization, not because life is collapsing, because too many unfinished details have begun taking up space. And every unfinished task consumes a little bit of mental energy, which leads directly into another major theme: mental fatigue. Honestly, this may be one of the most important messages in your entire reading, because the problem isn't necessarily what happens to you, the problem is what you keep carrying afterward. Gemini is one of the most mentally active signs in the zodiac. Your mind rarely stops moving. You solve one problem, then immediately remember another. You finish one responsibility, then start worrying about the next. You answer one message, then think about 3 more things you forgot to do. The reading shows this pattern becoming especially intense during the second half of the period, not because life becomes more difficult, because your mental load reaches a point where everything feels heavier. A small noise becomes irritating, a minor delay becomes frustrating, a simple request feels exhausting. The trigger isn't the event itself. The trigger is accumulation, weeks, months, perhaps even years of carrying too much inside your head. And the most important part, you become aware of it. The reading does not show loss of control. It shows recognition. You begin noticing when you're approaching your limit. You begin noticing when your patience is wearing thin. You begin noticing when you're reacting from exhaustion instead of clarity. And that awareness changes everything, because once you recognize the pattern, you can interrupt it, you can rest before burnout, you can step back before frustration takes over, you can choose where your energy goes. And honestly, that may become one of the most valuable skills you develop during this period. The reading repeatedly reminds you of something simple. Not everything deserves your reaction. Not everything deserves your attention. Not everything deserves your emotional investment. Some situations only become heavy because you continue carrying them. And Gemini is beginning to understand that. The more selective you become with your energy, the lighter your entire life begins to feel. And that realization marks the beginning of a very important transformation. Now, the reading moves into an area connected to money, work, and people who slowly drain your energy without you fully noticing it. And honestly, this is where things become much more intense. Because there is someone around you who has become far too comfortable benefiting from your effort. Not necessarily stealing from you. Not necessarily acting with bad intentions. But constantly taking. Constantly needing. Constantly creating situations that somehow become your responsibility to solve. The energy shows a very familiar pattern. This person always needs a favor, always needs support, always needs help, always needs advice, always needs your time, your attention, your resources, your emotional energy. And what makes it exhausting is that they behave as if this dynamic is completely normal, as if your availability has no limit, as if your generosity has no cost, but something is changing inside you. The reading clearly shows Gemini approaching a personal limit. You begin looking at certain situations and realizing, I'm carrying too much. I'm solving too many problems that aren't mine. I'm giving more than I'm receiving. And once that realization arrives, it becomes impossible to ignore. There is a strong energy of boundary setting emerging. Not dramatic boundaries, not explosive confrontations, gradual boundaries. You begin saying no more often. You begin becoming less available. You begin protecting your time, protecting your money, protecting your emotional energy. And interestingly enough, some people won't like that, because certain individuals became accustomed to your constant support. They became comfortable with your generosity, comfortable with your willingness to help, comfortable with your habit of carrying things for them. The reading suggests that your new boundaries may reveal who truly respects you and who simply benefited from your kindness. And honestly, that clarity becomes valuable. There is another financial message appearing, and this one feels surprisingly positive. The energy shows money arriving from an unexpected source. Not a fortune, not a life-changing windfall, but a relief. Something that improves your emotional state. This could be delayed money, a payment finally arriving, someone fulfilling a promise, a refund, a benefit, an opportunity, something you were no longer actively counting on. The interesting thing is that it appears when your expectations have already started fading. And because of that, the emotional impact feels stronger. The reading repeatedly shows the feeling of, finally, something is moving. And that feeling changes your entire energy, because Gemini enters a period where small victories matter far more than usual. One positive development can restore motivation. One solution can reduce weeks of stress. One piece of good news can remind you that progress is still possible. There is another area receiving strong attention, your professional life. And honestly, this may be one of the most encouraging sections of the reading, because there is a specific opportunity that begins capturing your focus. A position, a company, a career move, a professional path, a project, something that immediately triggers a powerful thought. If I can make this happen, my life changes. The interesting thing is that this energy does not feel like fantasy. It feels realistic, grounded, achievable. The reading repeatedly shows focus rather than wishful thinking. You begin researching, planning, learning, paying attention, considering possibilities seriously, and the potential here appears very real, particularly for people pursuing job opportunities, career advancement, competitive positions, professional certifications, government jobs, structured organizations, long-term stability. The energy supports growth, but there is an important condition attached to it: action. Nothing arrives automatically. Nothing falls from the sky. The opportunity exists, but it requires participation. The reading repeatedly shows preparation. Updating your resume, building skills, making connections, improving your strategy. Positioning yourself correctly. Because while luck may open a door, preparation is what allows you to walk through it. And honestly, Gemini is entering a period where preparation becomes incredibly valuable. There is also a growing awareness that certain professional habits need adjustment. Not because everything is failing, because you've outgrown certain systems. The reading shows you becoming increasingly aware of your need for autonomy, freedom, flexibility, control over your own workflow. You begin realizing that certain methods no longer fit who you're becoming, and that realization creates change, not necessarily immediately, but steadily. The desire for greater independence becomes stronger. The desire for greater ownership becomes stronger. The desire to create professional conditions that truly suit you becomes stronger. There is another positive indication involving someone in a position of influence. A manager, a supervisor, a business owner, a client, a mentor, someone whose opinion carries weight. The connection develops gradually, first through conversation, then through trust, then through opportunity. The reading shows this person beginning to recognize your value more clearly, and that recognition matters because Gemini enters a period where visibility starts increasing. People begin noticing your strengths, your ideas, your abilities, your potential, and that creates possibilities that did not exist before. Perhaps the most beautiful part of this professional energy is something very simple: satisfaction. The reading shows moments where you finally look at your work and think, this is how I wanted it to be. Not perfection, progress, a sense of ownership, a sense of control, a sense of accomplishment. Because your greatest frustration recently has not been hard work. It has been feeling restricted, limited, trapped, and whenever you recover movement, your energy changes completely. That is exactly what this period begins bringing back: movement, possibility, momentum, and with it comes a renewed belief that your efforts are finally leading somewhere meaningful. Now, the reading enters one of the most powerful areas of your life during this period: love. And honestly, the energy here feels completely different from what it did in previous cycles. Because for a long time, relationships may have existed on the surface. Conversations, attraction, interest, possibilities. But now something deeper begins emerging. The reading shows Gemini craving intensity, not drama, not chaos, not emotional confusion, real intensity, the kind that comes from genuine connection, the kind that makes you feel seen, understood, desired, chosen. Because one thing becomes very clear: you are growing tired of relationships that never move forward, tired of conversations that lead nowhere, tired of people who say all the right things but never take action, tired of emotional situations that remain permanently undefined. The energy repeatedly shows impatience, not because you have become difficult, because you finally understand your own value. You no longer want half-hearted effort, half-finished stories, half-committed people, half-expressed feelings. You want clarity, movement, presence, and that changes everything. There is a specific person appearing strongly throughout this reading, someone connected to your past. And unlike dramatic predictions that show someone desperately trying to return, this energy feels much more realistic. This person still thinks about you. The emotional connection still exists. But their life appears scattered, distracted, unfocused. The reading shows someone surrounded by other influences, new people, new routines, new distractions, new experiences. And because of that, they seem emotionally inconsistent, not disconnected, not fully available, something in between. The important thing to understand is that this person has not forgotten you, but they have not fully figured themselves out either. The energy repeatedly shows someone trying to move forward while simultaneously carrying unfinished feelings, and that creates a strange emotional tension. Because the absence begins growing louder, the comparisons begin growing stronger, the memories begin resurfacing, the reading shows something interesting happening over time. This person starts comparing current experiences to what they experience with you, and slowly, your absence becomes more noticeable, not overnight, not dramatically, gradually, which is why the reading keeps returning to the same theme. This is a process, not an explosion, not an immediate reunion. A process. There is another powerful area emerging here, and honestly, it may be one of the strongest themes of your entire forecast. Desire. Not only physical desire, emotional desire, creative desire, the desire to experience life more fully. The reading shows Gemini entering a period of heightened attraction, heightened curiosity, heightened need for excitement. You begin feeling restless with repetition, restless with routine, restless with emotional predictability. There is a part of you that wants more freedom, more spontaneity, more exploration, more authentic experiences. And this energy affects every area of intimacy. For some Geminis, this appears through attraction. For others, through curiosity. For others, through a growing desire to break old patterns. But the underlying message remains the same. Something inside you wants to feel alive again. The interesting part is that the reading does not show external obstacles. It shows internal hesitation. A hesitation created by overthinking. Because Gemini processes everything mentally, even desire, even attraction, even intimacy. Your mind often arrives before your emotions. Your analysis arrives before your actions. And because of that, there are experiences you may have wanted to explore long ago, but never fully allowed yourself to experience. Not because you lacked interest, because you questioned yourself too much. The reading suggests that this begins changing, slowly, gradually. You start becoming less concerned with judgment, less concerned with appearances, less concerned with how others might interpret your choices. And that creates freedom. There is another beautiful energy appearing for single Geminis, the possibility of a connection that begins with immediate chemistry, not necessarily a relationship, not immediately, but attraction, the kind of attraction that feels undeniable. A glance, a conversation, a moment, an unexpected encounter. The reading suggests this could appear through a social gathering, a trip, a new environment, an app, a shared activity, a new social circle. And what makes the energy interesting is the intensity of the exchange. Not because you instantly fall in love, because the connection feels alive, electric, different. But once again, the reading reminds you of something important. There is still a part of you that remains hidden, a deeper part, a more vulnerable part, a more authentic part. And this period is not only about meeting someone, it is about becoming brave enough to let that hidden part of yourself exist in front of another person. Because the greatest transformation happening here isn't romantic, it is personal. You are slowly learning how to stop controlling every feeling before it has a chance to live. And once that process begins, everything changes. Now the reading moves into one of the deepest themes of this entire cycle, your emotional world. And honestly, this may be where the greatest transformation takes place. Because there is something very clear appearing throughout the energy surrounding Gemini right now. You are tired, not physically, not necessarily, emotionally tired, mentally tired, spiritually tired. The reading repeatedly shows someone functioning normally on the outside while carrying enormous pressure internally. People look at you and assume everything is fine. You continue working, you continue responding, you continue solving problems, you continue moving forward. But inside your mind, dozens of thoughts continue competing for attention at the same time. And eventually, that becomes exhausting. The reading highlights a very important truth. The problem isn't what happened today. The problem is everything that has accumulated over time. Small frustrations, small disappointments, small worries, small emotional wounds, things you never fully processed, things you never fully released, things you simply carried forward while continuing to function. And now those accumulated emotions begin demanding attention. The energy shows something interesting. You may notice yourself reacting more strongly to situations that normally wouldn't affect you. A delayed response, an annoying comment, a minor inconvenience, a forgotten commitment. Something small suddenly feels much bigger. And the reason is simple. The emotional reservoir is already full. The reading repeatedly emphasizes that this period is not about weakness, it is about awareness. Because unlike previous cycles, you begin recognizing what is happening. You begin noticing when your patience is running low. You begin noticing when your emotional energy is depleted. You begin noticing when you're carrying more than you should. And that awareness becomes one of your greatest strengths. There is another important transformation taking place, a personal evolution, not the dramatic kind. Not the kind where you wake up as a completely different person. A deeper transformation, the kind where old versions of yourself quietly begin disappearing. The reading shows you outgrowing certain environments, outgrowing certain conversations, outgrowing certain relationships, outgrowing certain expectations. Things that once felt normal begin feeling exhausting. Things that once felt exciting begin feeling empty. Things that once felt necessary begin feeling optional. And honestly, that is a sign of growth, because growth often feels uncomfortable before it feels liberating. There is a powerful emotional filter developing around you. You begin becoming more selective, more intentional, more protective of your energy. You start asking questions you didn't ask before. Who deserves access to me? Who genuinely values me? Who only appears when they need something? Who contributes to my peace? Who constantly disrupts it? The reading suggests that these questions become increasingly important, and the answers begin changing your life. Because for a long time, Gemini tolerated situations simply to avoid conflict. You maintained connections because it seemed easier. You accepted dynamics because confronting them felt exhausting. But now something changes. You stop protecting everyone else's comfort at the expense of your own, and that creates freedom. There is another beautiful message appearing here. Silence. The reading repeatedly shows a need for quiet. Not loneliness, not isolation, quiet. A break from constant stimulation, a break from constant information, a break from constant conversation, because your mind has been running at full speed for far too long. And now your soul is asking for space, space to think, space to breathe, space to process, space to simply exist without demands. The interesting thing is that the more you respect this need, the better everything becomes. Your mood improves, your sleep improves, your productivity improves, your patience improves, your emotional stability improves. Because the greatest healing available to you right now may not come through action. It may come through stillness. And honestly, Gemini rarely gives themselves permission to slow down. But this period is teaching you something important. Rest is not a reward. Rest is a necessity, especially when your mind has been carrying the weight of an entire world. And the more you honor that truth, the more powerful your transformation becomes. Gemini sparkles. Now the reading begins moving toward one of the most positive shifts of the entire period, because after all the mental pressure, emotional overload, and constant sense of responsibility you've been carrying, something starts changing. You begin recovering yourself. And honestly, that may be the greatest prediction in this entire reading. Not because everything suddenly becomes easy. Not because all your problems disappear. But because your energy starts returning. The reading repeatedly shows a version of Gemini that has been operating below their true potential. Not because you lost your abilities, not because you lost your intelligence, not because you lost your charisma, because you became tired. And when exhaustion lasts long enough, it affects everything. Your confidence, your motivation, your enthusiasm, your creativity, your willingness to try new things, even your belief in yourself. But now the energy begins moving in the opposite direction. Little by little, you start feeling interested in life again. Interested in possibilities again, interested in people again, interested in experiences again. The reading shows enthusiasm returning, and for Gemini, enthusiasm is everything, because when your enthusiasm disappears, your entire world feels smaller, but when it returns, everything begins moving. There is also a very strong theme connected to self-esteem, and honestly, this may surprise you. because the reading suggests that many of your recent struggles were not caused by a lack of ability. They were caused by emotional exhaustion. You began doubting yourself, questioning yourself, second-guessing decisions you normally would have made with confidence. Not because you lacked talent, because you were carrying too much emotional weight. The good news is that this weight begins lifting, and when it does, something beautiful happens. You start seeing yourself differently. You begin remembering your strengths, your intelligence, your adaptability, your creativity, your ability to solve problems, your ability to connect with people, your ability to recover. The reading repeatedly shows confidence returning through action. Not through affirmation, not through wishful thinking, through evidence. You solve something, you accomplish something, you overcome something, and every small victory reminds you of who you really are. There is another important shift happening socially. You become more noticeable, more magnetic, more attractive. And what makes this interesting is that you're not actively trying. The energy shows this happening naturally because confidence creates presence, and presence attracts attention. People begin noticing you differently, not because your appearance changes overnight, because your energy changes, your eyes carry more life, your conversations carry more confidence, your movements carry more certainty. And people respond to that. The reading even suggests that compliments become more frequent, attention becomes more frequent, interest becomes more visible, and honestly, you deserve it because you've spent far too much time focusing on what was wrong instead of recognizing what is right about you. There is another powerful message connected to identity. The reading shows Gemini becoming less interested in pleasing everyone and more interested in being authentic. This is huge. Because for years, part of your energy adapted itself to fit different environments, different people, different expectations, different situations. But now you begin asking yourself a different question. What do I actually want? Not what keeps everyone happy, not what avoids conflict, not what creates approval, what feels true. And that question changes everything. Because the more authentic you become, the stronger your energy becomes. The reading also highlights a period of personal renewal. Some Geminis may change their appearance, others may change habits, others may change routines, others may change goals. The form doesn't matter. The underlying energy remains the same. Renewal. You begin aligning your outer life with the person you're becoming internally. And honestly, that alignment creates tremendous momentum because when your internal world and external world begin moving in the same direction, life feels easier, decisions feel clearer, relationships feel healthier, opportunities become easier to recognize. The reading ends this phase with a very powerful image. A Gemini who entered this period feeling overwhelmed, emotionally overloaded, mentally exhausted, constantly carrying pressure, but who gradually begins standing taller, thinking clearer, smiling more, trusting themselves again. And that transformation changes everything, because once Gemini recovers their enthusiasm, life starts moving much faster. Opportunities appear more easily. Relationships improve, work becomes more rewarding, and perhaps most importantly, you begin feeling like yourself again, and that is worth more than almost anything else. There's a final emotional layer that begins revealing itself during this period, And honestly, it may explain many of the experiences you've been living through recently, Because the reading shows that for a long time, you have been carrying tension without fully acknowledging it. You kept moving, kept adapting, kept solving problems, kept handling responsibilities. And because Gemini is naturally flexible, people often assume that nothing affects you deeply. But that's not true. You simply became skilled at functioning while carrying emotional weight. The problem is that emotional weight never truly disappears when it's ignored. It accumulates quietly, patiently, until one day, even small situations begin revealing how much you've been holding inside. The reading shows this very clearly. A simple delay feels bigger than it should. A minor disappointment lingers longer than expected. A comment bothers you more than usual. A misunderstanding drains more energy than it normally would. And suddenly you realize this isn't really about today. It's about everything you've been carrying, everything you've been postponing emotionally, everything you've been trying to manage intellectually instead of feeling honestly. Because Gemini has a habit of analyzing emotions instead of experiencing them. You try to understand them, explain them, organize them, rationalize them. But some emotions aren't asking to be analyzed. They're asking to be released. And that realization changes everything. There is another powerful transformation taking place. You begin recognizing that certain versions of yourself no longer belong in your future. Not because they were bad versions, because they served a purpose. The people-pleasing version, the over-explaining version, the version that tolerated too much, the version that kept giving endless chances, the version that stayed quiet to avoid conflict, the version that carried everyone else's emotional responsibilities. Those versions helped you survive certain chapters of your life, but they cannot guide you into the next chapter. And deep down, you already know that. The reading shows a growing emotional filter becoming stronger every day. You stop allowing everyone access to your energy. You stop allowing every opinion to affect you. You stop allowing every problem to become your responsibility. And honestly, that creates freedom, because one of the biggest sources of your recent exhaustion has been overexposure. Too many opinions, too many demands, too many expectations, too much noise. The energy repeatedly returns to one theme: simplicity, not boredom, simplicity, a life with fewer unnecessary complications, fewer forced relationships, fewer emotional obligations, fewer situations that require you to constantly prove yourself. And the more you move toward that simplicity, the stronger you become. There is also a very strong connection to intuition developing now, perhaps stronger than it has been in a long time. The reading shows unusual dreams, unexpected insights, strong instincts, moments where you simply know something without being able to explain how. And honestly, your intuition appears remarkably accurate during this cycle, particularly when it comes to people. You begin sensing motives more clearly. You begin recognizing hidden intentions faster. You begin identifying emotional manipulation more quickly. You begin understanding who genuinely supports you and who simply benefits from your presence. And because of that, your relationships start changing, not through conflict, through clarity. You stop ignoring signals. You stop making excuses for behavior that repeatedly disappoints you. You stop convincing yourself that things will change when every sign suggests otherwise. And that awareness becomes one of your greatest strengths. The reading also suggests a powerful shift in your communication. You begin understanding something important. Not every conversation requires an explanation. Not every disagreement requires a defense. Not every misunderstanding requires your energy. For years, you may have tried to explain yourself to people who had already decided not to understand. And honestly, that's exhausting. Now something changes. You become more selective with your words, more intentional, more strategic. You stop wasting energy trying to convince people who are committed to misunderstanding you, and that creates peace, real peace, the kind that comes from no longer carrying battles that were never yours to fight. And perhaps that is one of the most valuable lessons of this entire period. You do not have to explain your worth to people who refuse to see it. You simply need to recognize it yourself, and once that happens, everything begins changing from the inside out. There's another major shift approaching, and it revolves around something Gemini values deeply: freedom. Not physical freedom, not necessarily financial freedom, emotional freedom, the kind of freedom that comes when you stop carrying things that were never truly yours. Because the reading repeatedly shows a pattern you've lived with for much longer than you realize. You became responsible for other people's emotions, other people's expectations, other people's reactions, other people's disappointments. And over time, you started behaving as if maintaining everyone else's comfort was part of your job. But now, something begins changing. You start asking yourself a question that has the power to transform your entire life. Why am I carrying this? And honestly, many of the answers surprise you, because some burdens don't belong to you. Some responsibilities don't belong to you. Some emotional weights don't belong to you, yet you've been carrying them anyway. The reading shows a powerful period of release, not through anger, not through confrontation, through awareness. You begin recognizing what deserves your energy and what does not. You begin recognizing which relationships are reciprocal and which ones are one-sided. You begin recognizing where your effort creates growth and where it simply disappears without appreciation. And once you see these patterns clearly, it becomes impossible to ignore them. There is another strong theme appearing here: communication. And for Gemini, this is especially significant because communication becomes the tool that changes everything. The reading shows important conversations approaching, conversations that clarify misunderstandings, conversations that establish boundaries, conversations that finally address things left unsaid, conversations that transform relationships. Some of these discussions feel uncomfortable at first, not because they are wrong, because truth often feels uncomfortable before it feels liberating. The energy suggests that words carry unusual power during this period. Your words, other people's words, things that are finally expressed after being held back for a long time. And while some conversations bring closure, others bring new beginnings. The important thing is that silence is no longer enough. Things that have remained unresolved begin demanding attention. There is also a powerful lesson connected to over-explaining. The reading repeatedly shows Gemini exhausting themselves trying to make certain people understand, trying to justify decisions, trying to explain feelings, trying to provide endless context, trying to make everything clear. But here comes an important realization. Some people are not confused. Some people simply choose not to understand. And that distinction changes everything. Because once you understand it, you stop wasting energy. You stop repeating yourself. You stop carrying conversations that have already reached their natural conclusion. And honestly, that creates enormous emotional relief. There is another fascinating energy emerging around intuition. And this may become one of your greatest advantages. The reading shows your sensitivity becoming stronger. Dreams become more vivid. Instincts become sharper, observations become more accurate, you begin noticing things before they happen, you begin sensing changes in people's energy, you begin recognizing hidden motives, and perhaps most importantly, you stop dismissing your instincts. For too long, there were moments when your intuition spoke clearly, but your mind talked you out of it. You wanted proof, evidence, confirmation. Now something changes. You begin trusting what you feel, not blindly, wisely. And the reading suggests that this trust protects you from future disappointments, especially where relationships are concerned, because your intuition sees things your eyes often miss. The energy also highlights a period of personal reinvention, not because you become someone else, because you become more yourself. You may feel drawn toward changing your appearance, changing your style, changing your routines, changing your environment, changing the way you present yourself to the world. The external change reflects an internal shift, a shift toward authenticity, toward confidence, toward self-expression, toward freedom. And honestly, people notice the reading shows increased attention, increased attraction, increased visibility. You become more magnetic. Not because you're trying harder, because you're carrying less emotional weight. And when Gemini stops carrying unnecessary burdens, your natural light becomes impossible to ignore. This phase is teaching you something profound. The more you release what no longer belongs in your life, the more room you create for what truly does. And that lesson changes everything moving forward. As this cycle begins approaching its conclusion, something beautiful starts happening. You begin recovering your personal power. Not power over other people. Not power over situations. Power over yourself. And honestly, that may be the most valuable thing you gain during this entire period. Because for a long time, your emotional state was being influenced by too many external factors. Other people's opinions, other people's moods, other people's expectations, other people's decisions. And without realizing it, you gave away pieces of your peace every time you allowed those things to dictate how you felt. The reading shows that changing now, you become less reactive. less dependent on validation, less dependent on approval, less dependent on circumstances, and much more connected to your own inner stability. There is a powerful realization appearing repeatedly. You cannot control everything. You cannot control everyone. You cannot predict every outcome. And surprisingly, that realization becomes liberating. Because the moment you stop trying to control everything, you recover energy. Mental energy, emotional energy, creative energy, life energy. The energy you've been spending on things that were never truly yours to manage. The reading also highlights a strong period of self-respect, and this becomes visible in every area of your life. You stop accepting emotional crumbs. You stop lowering your standards. You stop making excuses for behavior that continuously hurts you. You stop pretending certain situations are acceptable when they clearly are not. And that changes the way people interact with you. Because when Gemini finally values themselves fully, others either rise to meet that standard or slowly disappear. There is another strong message involving relationships, not only romantic relationships, all relationships, friendships, family dynamics, professional connections, social circles. The reading shows a process of natural separation taking place, not because of conflict, because of alignment. You begin gravitating toward people who bring peace, people who inspire you, people who support your growth, people who genuinely want to see you succeed. At the same time, you naturally begin distancing yourself from people who create constant confusion, constant drama, constant emotional chaos. And honestly, this isn't rejection. It's evolution, because not everyone is meant to accompany you into your next chapter. There is another beautiful energy appearing around confidence. The reading shows you beginning to trust your own decisions again. For a while, you may have doubted yourself, questioned your instincts, delayed choices because you feared making mistakes. But now something shifts. You begin understanding that perfection is not required. You don't need every answer before taking action. You don't need certainty before moving forward. You simply need trust. Trust in your ability to adapt. Trust in your ability to learn. Trust in your ability to recover if something doesn't go as planned. And honestly, Gemini has always been far more resilient than they realize. The reading repeatedly shows a person who has survived far more than most people know. Challenges, disappointments, unexpected changes, emotional setbacks, periods of uncertainty. And despite all of it, you kept moving, you kept growing, you kept evolving. That strength is still there. Perhaps stronger than ever. There is also a strong feeling of anticipation surrounding your future. Not anxiety, anticipation. The feeling that something is beginning to move, something is beginning to shift, something is beginning to open. You may not see the full picture yet. You may not know exactly where everything is heading, but you can feel momentum returning. And that feeling matters because for a long time, stagnation felt heavier than any obstacle. Now, movement returns, hope returns, possibility returns. And with them comes a renewed belief that your life can become something bigger than the worries you've been carrying. The reading closes this phase with a powerful truth. You are no longer the person who entered this cycle. You think differently, feel differently, see people differently, see yourself differently, and those changes are preparing you for opportunities that the old version of you may not have been ready to receive. That is why this period feels so important. It is not just about solving problems. It is about becoming stronger than the problems themselves. And Gemini is doing exactly that. There is one final message surrounding this entire journey, and honestly, it may be the most important one of all. Because after everything shown in this reading, the mental overload, the financial concerns, the emotional confusion, the professional ambitions, the relationships, the boundaries, the exhaustion, one truth remains at the center of it all. You are finally taking your energy back, and that changes everything. For a long time, your greatest challenge was not the outside world. It was the amount of weight you continued carrying inside your own mind, the endless thoughts, the unfinished conversations, the worries about tomorrow, the responsibility for other people's emotions, the pressure to solve everything, the pressure to understand everything, the pressure to hold everything together. And little by little, all of that began stealing something from you, your lightness. your enthusiasm, your sense of freedom. But now the reading shows something different, a return, not to the person you used to be, to the person you were always meant to become. Because growth is not about going backward. It is about moving forward with wisdom. The energy repeatedly shows Gemini entering a period of emotional liberation. You stop accepting situations simply because they are familiar. You stop maintaining relationships simply because they have existed for a long time. You stop carrying emotional obligations that no longer make sense. And perhaps most importantly, you stop abandoning yourself. There is a very powerful realization approaching. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your energy. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your time. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your heart. And once that realization settles into your spirit, your entire life begins reorganizing itself. The reading shows you becoming more selective, more intentional, more protective of your peace. Not because you've become cold, because you've become wise. There is also a beautiful sense of personal renewal surrounding your future. You begin seeing possibilities where before you only saw obstacles. You begin seeing opportunities where before you only saw delays. You begin seeing growth where before you only saw frustration. And this shift changes the way you approach life. Because when your mindset changes, your decisions change. When your decisions change, your path changes. And when your path changes, your future changes. The energy also shows a stronger relationship with your intuition than ever before. You stop ignoring red flags. You stop dismissing instincts. You stop talking yourself out of what you already know deep down. And because of that, your choices become clearer, smarter, stronger, more aligned with your true self. There is another important message connected to self-worth. The reading repeatedly shows Gemini understanding something that took a long time to learn. You do not have to earn love by overgiving. You do not have to earn respect by over-explaining. You do not have to earn acceptance by becoming smaller. The people who truly belong in your life will not require you to abandon yourself. And once you understand that, your entire emotional world changes. The final image of this reading is incredibly powerful. It is not the image of someone who has solved every problem. It is not the image of someone living a perfect life. It is the image of someone who has recovered their strength, someone who has recovered their voice, someone who has recovered their confidence, someone who has recovered their hope. And honestly, that matters more than any prediction about money, work, or relationships. Because when Gemini recovers their enthusiasm for life, everything else begins moving naturally. The opportunities arrive, the relationships improve. The decisions become clearer. The future feels brighter. The path opens. And that is exactly where this cycle is leading you. Not toward perfection. Toward momentum. Not toward a life without challenges. Toward a life where challenges no longer control you. Not toward becoming someone else. Toward becoming more fully yourself. And that is the true transformation of this reading. A Gemini who entered this period carrying too much weight, slowly remembering what it feels like to be light again, to trust again, to hope again, to dream again, to live again. And once that process begins, there is very little that can stop you, because your greatest victory was never over other people. It was over everything that convinced you to forget your own strength, and now you are finally remembering it. Gemini sparkles, folded hands,